implications for multiculturalism on Canadian post-secondary music curricula. And I know that this was brought home to me a couple of years ago when I was speaking to someone at the Winnipeg New Music Festival, and they told me that there are more professional DJ players in China than there are professional violinists in Canada. So I went, that has some implications for us, along with a lot of other things that I know that when Dean Gation has been over there, he's bombarded by our players and many other instruments that would like to come and study over here. And we just had a little inquiry for someone who plays the Comanche from Iran. So lots of interesting things on the horizon for us as music schools. So looking forward to this.
Thanks, Pat. I'm not always good with microphones, so let me know. Okay. I debated where to start this paper. With the nature of contemporary Canadian identity, with how Canadian post-secondary music schools, for innumerable reasons, not least of which is the bureaucratic burden of systemic change, routinely turn away students from their programs in ways that could be interpreted as exclusionary or even racist. Do I start with how our programs continue to churn out students with declining prospects as performers? How these students who will more than likely have to teach will find themselves without adequate pedagogical skills to cope with the myriad of learning disabilities, identity issues, and intercultural problems they will encounter. There was a time that our exclusive musical culture could get away with saying to that child's parent, "Oh, I'm sorry, your son just doesn't have talent." And we could close the door. We can't do that anymore. Today we must provide access and opportunity to all. That word we like to use, artistic excellence, we need to reframe it. Should I start then with what I think we need to include in our curricula? With why we need to go back to the roots of Western art music and, like almost every other musical system of the world, learn the building blocks of our music so that we can relearn how to improvise like Bach and Mozart did? So that we can talk to musicians from all those other musical cultures who know how their music is put together, so that we can create something new? Our musical infrastructure has been built upon a solid foundation, but it has built walls that we now need to dismantle. Walls between performance and theory, between musicology and ethnomusicology, between composition and improvisation, between education, philosophy, and performance. Did I say performance again? Between creation and recreation. We have built a fortress around this thing we call classical music, Western art music. We open the gates a crack to let a few outsiders in to sell us their wares. We know this smattering of the exotic is good for our social economy, and that type of cultural capital makes us look really good to the funders. Hello, Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada? Yeah. We've let jazz in, but we've forced it to create a pedagogical RNA parallel to ours. How much do we talk about the socio-cultural origins of jazz and the correlative political impact of our co-opting it? There's a word for that, and you might not like it. Structural racism. I'm going to start with a little story. Growing up, my mother always told me not to get involved with politics, not to talk about politics. And I'm not sure if that was the Anglo-Canadian values she learned growing up in the 30s and 40s, that women don't talk about politics, or if it was her inherent understanding that politics were not meant for us, the brown, the black, and the yellow people, who happened to have been born here when the country was still legally racist, and as a result of which we could only ever be peripheral to the country's social and political system. My mother was never sure about my becoming a musician, stubborn though I was. She feared the racism I might encounter along the way. And yes, I did have to deal with all types of racism, and a lot of sexism too. So Mom was finally happy when I got a PhD, but sorry Mom, humanities PhDs these days are inherently political degrees. And although you taught me that life is not fair and everyone should just accept what comes, that is what my religion says, it is not what the current leaders of our country advocate. So in my own small way, I can be idle no more. And therein I shall begin. The title of a Canadian anti-racism workbook by Carl E. James is called Seeing Ourselves. Let us begin by imagining we are all products and proselytizers of the Western art music tradition, and I ask my jazz colleagues to bear with me. I recently asked a few colleagues, particularly composers who have arrived at Western art composition via a trajectory that started with playing in a punk rock band, then pursuing jazz studies to learn about harmony, then crossing over to the holy grail of sound manipulation, Western classical composition. I have asked these colleagues whether they see Western art music as elitist or ethnoculturally closed. To a person, each one has said, no, Western classical music is open, it allows everyone in, it doesn't ascribe to any ethnocultural identifiers. And to some extent, like the Western notion of democracy, this might be true, but there is a problem. This is an orchestra I've played with for 23 years. It's the Esprit Orchestra, an orchestra dedicated to the performance of contemporary music with an emphasis on Canadian composers. It is not an auditioned orchestra. It operates upon recommendation basis because, frankly, one needs serious chops, good sight reading skills, and a lot of patience to play with this band. Take a good look at it. Don't we expand it a bit more? Children tend to imagine themselves pursuing careers and lifestyles of their role models, parents, teachers, mentors, and others like them. But what if there is no role model? What if there is no one on the stage that looks like you? What if, after 20 years, there is still no one on that stage who looks like me? We could look at many other professional Canadian orchestras and find the same thing. And yes, there are many people of East Asian extraction in orchestras, and the percentage of Western classical musicians of Japanese, Korean, and Chinese descent pursuing Western art music has increased exponentially over the past 30 years. And yes, they count as people of color. But where are the cellists of African, South Asian, or Middle Eastern ancestry? And why are they not there? I have a theory about this, and you can ask me later. Before I leave this picture, I want to tell you about my friend Renee. Renee often sits at the back of our first violin section. She's a good, solid violinist who freelances with the Canadian Opera Company and the National Ballet Orchestras. Renee's father is Afro-Caribbean. Her mother is a Franco-Canadian from Ottawa. Renee's maternal grandfather played in the Toronto Symphony. When she sees me at a spree, Renee always says, "Yo, Rosa, I'm at the back of the bus." Her greeting is a coded reference to the fact that, like Rosa Parks, I've managed to sit on the first stand of the Esprit bus, and she is at the back. Renee's goal is to get a gig with an American orchestra, in part so that she might be in the company of people who look like her. Certainly in the Toronto area, people of Afro-Canadian, Afro-Caribbean background in orchestras, I think there are only two. One is Renee, and the other young woman is significantly younger. She's in her late 20s. In the United States, many orchestras have created opportunities for African Americans to become involved in Western classical music. In doing so, they have removed economic and social impediments to involvement. Can we do the same thing here, as I suspect Orchestras Canada wants to do? I'm not sure we can. Because while there are people who cannot afford Western classical music, many members of visible minority ethnocultures actively choose not to become a part of a musical system they see as colonial. Official multiculturalism and the way it has been embodied socioculturally has left us with a different way of involving ethnocultural groups into Canadian expressive life. For that reason, we need to first own the legacy of our colonial past, and then we need to come up with ways of teaching music at the post-secondary level that allow us to practice the modern Canadian ideals we proudly tout to the world, particularly at this moment in time. Inclusivity, equality of opportunity, and respect for diversity.
Where is that stage, Doctor?
That's Kerner Hall in Toronto.
Kerner Hall.
Kerner Hall. Do you know Kerner Hall at the Royal Conservatory of Music? It's the new hall.
It was built after I was last there, so
yeah, it's beautiful.
It is a lovely acoustic.
Yeah. Best acoustics in the city.
Okay.
So, some of my colleagues say it's the only reason to still play with the orchestra. Just a bit of eye candy. What are the goals of Canadian life? What are the ideals that Justin Trudeau's tweets constantly promote? What is the message? The message to the refugees and to the potential refugees. Welcome. Come to Canada, where we will endeavor to let you live a peaceful life. Through multicultural legislation, Canadians have suggested that the methods by which we aim to achieve this goal of a peaceful life are by respecting our differences, by enabling equality of opportunity regardless of differences, by being inclusive of all of those differences. And the desired result of this is an engaged citizenry where every person feels valued and has a sense of belonging. The goals of Canadian citizenry are much deeper than mere tolerance, and the aims are more than tokenism. On Facebook these days, I see post after post that is forlorn and despairing at the state of today's socio-political world. I'm thankful to be here, removed from the heavy cloud that seems to be hanging over my colleagues in Toronto, and also over the province of Quebec these weeks. And because you are inviting me to be here to share my ideas with you, I can't help but be hopeful as I can see Canadian ideals glimmering in stark relief to what we are witnessing elsewhere in the world. We are, I believe, at a pivotal moment for taking actions that are uniquely Canadian, actions that, unlike the path we have followed before, in structuring our sociocultural institutions, do not require us to follow external templates. Our template is encoded in our human rights and multicultural legislations. Many Canadian businesses have been incorporating these values into their hiring and best practices. Collectively, we are hearing diversity is our strength. How are we doing in our post-secondary institutions? I don't know other academic departments as well, but I know a bit about what's going on in Canadian post-secondary music departments. What would happen if we did a SWOT analysis? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Are you ready? I'll be nice. Strengths. And I'm doing this a bit loosely. Strengths that I see at the music school here at Brandon University. Relatively small classes, which makes a good teacher-to-student ratio. Good performance opportunities. Dedicated students. From what I've seen, they are, for the most part, quite dedicated to their craft. A healthy learning environment. More generally, in our music faculties, the one-to-one teacher-student relationship that is part of the Western performance training is an extraordinary example of mentorship and modeling that few other academic units have, and often students do not have access to this until they get to the graduate level in other departments. In order to change, we need to expose our weaknesses. Politically, nationally, we have been exposing one of the ugliest weaknesses we have, our treatment of Canada's Indigenous peoples. Successive governments and inquiries have been trying to tackle this for years, but with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the inquiries into murdered and missing Indigenous women, it feels like we're actually tackling it. In lockstep, we've been dealing with multiple layers of colonialism, and our judiciary continues its action towards sexual equality. The action to expose these weaknesses is taking place at the governance level, with help from the media. I suspect changes in attitude amongst Canadian citizenry will take a little bit longer. What are the weaknesses of our music institutions? The word institution is a good place to start. We have entrenched and institutionalized values about music that no longer represent contemporary Canada, nor Canadian values. We are almost 30 years behind the program. In 1992, Cameron Bailey, who is currently the artistic director of the Toronto International Film Festival, he offered a pointed critique of systemic racism in Canadian arts councils. He pinpoints issues that, 25 years later, yes, 25, before most of our students were born, if we replace the word arts councils with music departments, we'll find us party to maintaining a racist system. Definitions of excellence, professionalism, and art itself are biased in favor of European high art traditions. In other words, and I've used music departments instead of his words. In other words, music departments ignore both the complexity of the communities they serve and the dangerous internal rot indicated by systemic racism. In a country where a working artist is almost by definition a government-funded artist, the situation amounts to state-sanctioned cultural apartheid. Racism is a tough word. Anti-racism advocacy has been the natural successor to the original multicultural campaign for recognition, and the contemporary campaigns of anti-racist activists are deeply entwined with multiculturalism and multicultural politics. To a certain extent, the terms equity advocacy and anti-racism advocacy are interchangeable. Achieving equity is the goal, and to reiterate, equity and respect for difference is fundamental to an engaged citizenry. An engaged citizenry is a necessary prerequisite for peaceful coexistence of people of diverse lifestyles. Thus, we find that after the passing of the Multicultural Act, with laws of equal citizenship on their side, anti-racism advocates began tackling the country's racism and Eurocentrism. Beginning in the 1990s, official strategies to combat race-based and ethnic prejudices began to change the functioning and priorities of all federal government structures and bureaucracies. At the Arts Councils, efforts to remedy funding imbalances attributable to non-Western ethnocultural differences have taken place over the past 20 years. But an equitable outcome that reflects Canadian demography continues to be problematic. It is one of the reasons that arts councils, particularly the Canada Council, continues to prioritize non-Western and non-classical art forms and to adjust their programming in order to support non-Eurocentric types of art. And I don't know if anyone has looked at the Canada Council website lately. There's no genre there at all, and a lot of it's about process. And continuing engagement with visible minorities and people with disabilities and Indigenous peoples. Those are the priorities. With much respect to my colleagues who suggest that Western art music is not an ethno-culturally biased system, bearing in mind the extraordinary demographic changes that have taken place in Canada over the past decade, let us take a look again at the 1988 Multicultural Act. And I've highlighted a few words here. The official title is the Canadian Multiculturalism Act, an act for the preservation and enhancement of multiculturalism in Canada. The act formally acknowledges Canadian commitment to equality and equal protection by law of all individuals, irrespective of their beliefs, backgrounds, or differences. Critically, the act recognizes the diversity of Canadians as regards race, national or ethnic origin, color, and religion as a fundamental characteristic of Canadian society, and is committed to a policy of multiculturalism designed to preserve and enhance the multicultural heritage of Canadians while working to achieve the equality of all Canadians in the economic, social, cultural, and political life of Canada. Within the Multiculturalism Act is the Multiculturalism Policy. The policy sets goals for creating multicultural atmosphere and offers open-ended hints at what we need to do to create a multicultural community. The specifics of how we go about doing this within our faculties of music are the challenges facing us. So let's examine a few of the policies. Sorry, they're there. My mistake. 1A, freedom of all members of Canadian society to preserve, enhance, and share their cultural heritage. How much are we allowing others to share their cultural heritage with us? Or does music as cultural heritage exist outside of the academy? You have an Indigenous Studies program here, I believe, and a 15% Indigenous population in Brandon. That's significant. Do 15% of Brandonites listen to classical music daily? Where is someone to teach us about the role of music in Brandon's Indigenous community? 1B, multiculturalism is a fundamental characteristic of the Canadian heritage and identity, and that it provides an invaluable resource in the shaping of Canada's future. Are we tapping into the wealth of musical resources around us? 1C, this is a big one. Elimination of any barrier to that participation. What are the barriers we have to participation? I did a superficial survey of Canadian post-secondary music institutions, and I used entry requirements as my yardstick for barriers to participation. So here's what I found. I forgot University of Western Ontario, but I already made the chart, so I apologize. So I don't know if you can see that. Of the institutions I surveyed, Simon Fraser University, York University, and Concordia were the only ones that intimated, and they didn't overtly say it, but they intimated that non-Western or non-classical musicians were welcome to apply at the undergraduate level. Each institution did, however, have theory requirements. The University of Victoria had interesting goals, ones that I think every institution, let alone every music department, ought to adapt adopt, and I don't know if we can read them. Can you read that? Shall I read it?
Not back here.
Oh, okay, let me see if I can find my little chart. All right. I just went west to east when I did this thing. So they say, enhance students' knowledge of Canadian and Indigenous music. That's one of their 6 goals for their students. And they also suggest prepare students to critically analyze, assess, and evaluate information on a range of subjects. So that was... University of Alberta had an interesting focus on world sound arts, ethnomusicology, electroacoustic music, and popular music. Queen's University had a fairly unique course in which one can learn to be both a rock star and a classical musician. That'll probably have work. Otherwise, everyone else had UBC, University of Calgary, University of Saskatchewan. I couldn't get any information. Strange website. Brandon University, York, U of T, McGill, Memorial, minimum grade 8 RCM, even to apply. What happens if you come from a country that doesn't have RCM? What happens if you're Canadian and you play an instrument that doesn't have RCM exams, but you've been studying it for 10 years? Basically your whole childhood. Okay. So, I don't get this. Let's see. I'll come back to items in the multiculturalism chart later. But I want to take a look at the second part of the policy as it pertains to federal institutions. There are lessons here for us. So let's replace the word federal institutions with universities. To ensure that Canadians of all origins have an equal opportunity. Promote policies, programs, and practices that enhance the ability of individuals and communities of all origins to contribute to the continuing evolution of Canada. To promote policies, programs, and practices that enhance the understanding of and respect for the diversity of the members of Canadian society. And generally, carry on their activities in a manner that is sensitive and responsive to the multicultural reality of Canada. We need to do better. So what are we going to do about the Santoor player from Iran? The gay Arhu player who fled persecution in China? The 18-year-old songwriter from Rwanda whose family sent him to Toronto? He comes to our refugee music circle every week, eager to learn everything he can about music. And then there's the tabla whiz from Saskatoon. Did you hear about him? He played timpani in his school orchestra, drum kit in band, and tabla in the Sikh temple. He went to Cal Arts in Los Angeles, where he learned how to put all of these things together, and he is now Hans Zimmer's personal percussionist. If you hear tabla on any Hollywood soundtrack, it's probably him. Yes, he's from Saskatoon. And though I selfishly wish he might, he won't be coming back to Canada anytime soon. He's of my generation. We went to youth camp together. But there were no options for him in Canada 30 years ago to combine his ethno-cultural self with his musical aspirations. Today, the ethno-cultural diversity of Canada is much, much less European than 30 years ago, and that trend is not diminishing. Unfortunately, for me, The results of the 2016 census are being released tomorrow. So I can't show them to you. And the last ones we have are from 2006. So what are the obstacles to participation? Why is it so difficult to take down the walls of our fortresses of sound? Is it because we know that music is not a universal language? Earlier I mentioned that some of my colleagues who are composers suggested that Western classical music allows everyone in. On one level, my colleagues who came from the world of head-bashing, guitar-thrashing punk bands might be implying that Western art music is not elitist. And the word elitism, we know, is getting a bad rap these days. But in cultures the world over, sounds organized by humans, what we call music, are produced by members of a community in order to communicate with other members of that community. Unless we know that culture well, or take the time to learn more about it, we cannot know what layers of significance or signification are encoded in that sound. Is what they do is sacred? Is it part of a rite of passage? Is it simply as a lullaby? Or is it a political song? We don't know. Let's take, for example, a South Indian mridangam player who spends his life, and yes, they are all men, he spends his life memorizing and executing strings of algebraic formulas on his drum. He would be bored listening to this, where am I? He would be bored by the static rhythmic frame of a jazz standard or of a classical string quartet. Does he know to listen to the shifting harmonies above the rhythm? No. Vertical melodic density does not exist in Carnatic music. They are not interested in physically grooving to the beat. They and their audiences love counting. They really love counting. And they love replicating the geometry of their architecture in sound. And they have this fascinating, the temples of South India are all built so that there's no shadow. And so they create these strings of numbers in their rhythms that have the same formulas as for creating buildings that cast no shadow. So they want to exercise their brains. And one thing I've noticed about South Indian audiences, they sit very, very still. They are not as easily impressed as the outsider by the mathematical feats replicated in finger strokes against a goatskin drum. Why not? Because this method of counting is simply part of Carnatic culture encoded in sound. We also know that intonation is not universal. Temper tuning is becoming standardized amongst popular musicians of the world, thanks to the ubiquity of the guitar. But even Pythagorean tuning has a limited audience. So how then could we ever create a music theory course that is fair? A few weeks ago, I talked about the ethnocultural festivals organized by the Canadian Pacific Railway. And I did not mention, and I'll take the opportunity to do so now, that the perspectives of the festival's organizer, John Murray Gibbon, were also broadcast in a radio series on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC. The CBC having originated as part of the Canadian railway infrastructure. Gibbon's festivals had two implications pertinent to a discussion of ethnoculturalism in Canadian arts. Firstly, the festivals introduced British Canadians to Canada's minority ethnocultures through their expressive culture, their music, their dance, their handicrafts, and their costumes. Secondly, the festivals brought otherwise private aspects of cultural belonging into the public realm. Many of the non-British and non-French European ethnocultures came to Canada having been lured by the guarantee that they were free to maintain their ethnocultural lifestyle. Many such groups came to the prairies, and we find them here in Manitoba. Ukrainians, Hutterites, Doukhobors, Mennonites, Icelanders. The argument for official multiculturalism in the 1960s, as opposed to merely French-English biculturalism, originated in these communities. They wanted public recognition for their contribution to the Canadian macroculture, and they wanted access to funding for heritage preservation and expression. Thus, the first line of the Multicultural Act acknowledges the freedom of all members of Canadian society to preserve, enhance, and share their cultural heritage. What many of the ethno-cultural groups who fought for recognition did not anticipate was that their arguments would be taken up by visible minority ethno-cultural groups under the banner of anti-racism advocacy. As a result, race politics has had a profound effect on identity construction in Canada. Equally profound is the cultural symbolism imbued in music. Ethno-cultural communities use music and other expressive devices to display their group publicly. They simultaneously use expressive culture to mark and maintain their difference from other minority cultures and from the Canadian macro-culture. Moreover, minority ethno-cultures rely upon their sense of community belonging for identity construction and to challenge the normativity of Eurocentric values and aesthetics. So I want to take a little detour here to define anti-racism advocacy in the Canadian context because its function is distinct to that found elsewhere. In the United Kingdom, the term most often used to discuss the social influence of race and its ramifications is racialization. In the United States, it is racial formation. In Canada, the primary concerns of anti-racist advocates is systemic racism. The focus in Canada is collectivities, networks of social machinations greater than the individual. The implication is the collectivities harbor and sustain racist thought and behavior, whether consciously or unconsciously, in order to maintain the status quo. I feel like this mic is dropping. Is it dropping? To expose structural racism, anti-racist activists look at who is seen, who is heard, who is hired, who receives contracts, who receives funding, who is enrolled. They contrast the who's with the who is not seen, not heard, not hired, not contracted, not funded, not enrolled. In this way, anti-racist theorists have found patterns clearly pointing towards a history of systemic biases against non-European and non-Western behaviors and practices in Canadian institutions. Do we see ourselves yet? I also mentioned in my talk a few weeks ago that Canadian arts councils maintained beliefs in the supremacy and normativity of Eurocentric aesthetics into the early 1990s. Aspects of this supremacy continue to linger, not necessarily amongst full-time council employees, but more among the peer assessors hired by the councils to help make decisions on arts grants. These attitudes are extra-structural to the councils. They're learned prejudices that contribute to maintaining a level of structural racism in the arts. Where are they learned? In the list of universities I showed you earlier, I had a column labeled Ethnomusicology PhD. It was right on the end. Ethnomusicology, as those in my class have heard, is the erroneous term given to the field that we ethnomusicologists believe is the true musicology, the study of humanly organized sound and silence. Whereas the focus of musicology is the music history and personalities of Western art music, and occasionally jazz, ethnomusicology is the catch-all field that studies everything else about music. It is not the study of ethnic music. It studies music in religious traditions. It studies music in healing, the various functions and roles of music in any culture of the world, the musical repertoire of any instrument or tradition in the world, the interplays between song and politics, between music and dance, between music and geographical space, between performer and audience, between performance and physiology, between sound and psychology. Ethnomusicology is also the place where we accommodate performing musicians of non-Western music traditions. We put musicians of non-classical traditions there too, the jazz, folk, and rock musicians who don't have the option of a DMA degree. In fact, many of them skipped the undergraduate degree and slipped into academia at the master's level. A lot of my colleagues did it that way. And while the senior members of my field were once Western classically trained musicians, most of today's ethnomusicologists under the age of 50 do not have backgrounds in Western classical music, nor are they going to defend its continued presence in academic institutions. Moreover, because degrees in ethnomusicology start at the graduate level, we force our non-Western and non-classical musicians to examine their musical tradition through the lenses of social and critical theory. We demand that they contextualize the microscopic nuances of their subject matter through a contemporary macroscopic lens. Why do we not ask the same of the students who go through our undergraduate programs, particularly the performance majors? Their course loads are already too heavy. Bad excuse. How are they going to defend their music making once they leave school? Once they are subjected to those who ask what purpose their music serves in contemporary Canada? It's great music composed by masters. No, doesn't cut it. Other musics have their masters too. How then do we create a music school that lets everyone in? How do we create music that is Canadian? We have to let ourselves be open to systems that are, at first, uncomfortable. We have to be open to the discomfort of being in a musical system that is radically different than ours. We have to be open to it and respectful of it. And then we negotiate. It is not easy and it takes a lot of time. We have to offer the teachings of ethnomusicology to our students, or really just musicology. From my perspective as a person of color, a trip through the exotica of world music in a course is like taking a cruise around South America. It's a superficial flirtation that may excite superficial curiosity, which in and of itself is fine, so long as we are not expecting it to do any more than that. But a world music course does not give us the tools to appreciate with any depth. Canadian ethnomusicology needs to be specific. We need to give our students the tools to examine Canadian identity construction and how identity is signified musically. We need to give them the tools to recognize and deconstruct the impacts of colonialism, racism, and European elitism in music making. And then we have to ask what Canadian music is. What is music to ethnocultural maintenance? Or, as the Multicultural Act suggests, as a site of cultural preservation? How do we learn it and perform it as part of an ethnocultural self? How does cultural preservation impact our identity construction? And as defining one's identity becomes a more significant aspect of being Canadian, we need to be honest about Western musicology. We need to begin reframing the questions we use to talk about Western art composition. What about the ethnocultural borrowings in Mozart? Gamelan in the music of Ravel and Debussy? Blues in Dvorak's American and post-American composition? How were such borrowings perceived or considered acceptable then? It was okay to borrow from the primitives then. So let's discuss the notion of primitivism. Let's discuss exoticism and how, while it glorifies one aspect of a culture, it ignores cultural ownership. And then let's deconstruct pieces like this. I don't have sound. So, I was telling my students last week, I think, that at the school where I teach in Toronto, we've decided to celebrate Black History Month by having a concert of music that somehow is related to Black history. And so I asked all my teachers to think about that when they chose their repertoire, and one of the teachers chose this piece for his student. And of course I thought, great, the director of the conservatory? No. It's like, we're not playing that piece. I was like, why not? I said, no, because I don't want to have that conversation with the parents. So, oh well. It's problematic, but I think we need to talk about it. And it's a perfect opportunity to start a dialogue about racism. If we were honest and contextualize the history of Western art music using contemporary frames of reference, we will bring a social justice to our field that might just inspire ethnocultural outsiders to examine with us instead of against us. One might say that much of what I'm suggesting about Western post-secondary musical training falls under the T, the threat category of a SWOT analysis. A threat to the status quo, yes, but let's consider it a challenge of reconstruction. Sometimes we need to add a support beam or two to an old house. What else can we do? What about ethnocultural dialogue? Item 1B of the Multiculturalism Act states that multiculturalism provides an invaluable resource in the shaping of Canada's future. 1G says that we should promote the understanding and creativity that arises from the interaction between individuals and communities of different ethnic origins. These categories are opportunities waiting to be explored. For those who remember, let's consider 2 moments in time featuring Queen Elizabeth II. Kind of. Oh yeah, is it today is her anniversary? Or yesterday?
Yesterday was
65th.
Accession Day.
Okay. So I don't know how many people remember this. 1981, the signing of the Canadian Constitution.
1982.
82?
Yeah.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. It was the spring of 1982.
Okay.
Sorry about
I should know that. The government held a gala at the National Arts Centre. Each province offered an artist or an artistic group to represent the province. I remember Louis Lortie, Maureen Forrester, and a host of other Western classical musicians on the stage. And then there was this random group of kids playing fiddle from Alberta. Albertans have a way of being a bit ornery about fitting in. Okay, now let's skip ahead. July 1st, 2001. Canada Day in Ottawa, with the newlyweds, Prince William and Kate Middleton. Again, the organizers attempted to present the country geographically. The closest we got to classical music, though, was opera singer Misha Brugger-Gosman as one of the MCs for the event. Most of the ensembles exhibited some degree of ethnoculturalism, either overtly or subtly related to their geographical region. Nova Scotia was, of course, represented by a Celtic ensemble. The North by throat singers. And the Celtic ensemble, I think, might have even been the Rankins. But I particularly remember my colleague, fiddler Jaron Freeman Fox, performing with a Punjabi folk band. Someone had thought this would be a good idea. Both were from the West Coast, and at one point in time, Jaron had gone to India to try to learn both Carnatic and Hindustani violin techniques. They should be able to figure this thing out, right? Not right. Crossovers are often extraordinarily difficult to navigate, and folk music is not unlike Western classical music in that its function is to recreate as opposed to create. Our creators, have historically been composers. The opportunity I see here is in working with our students on interacting with other ethno-cultural musics to create new Canadian musics. Traditionally, composers have been the interlocutors in this process, but this can create a problematic hierarchy when working with improvising traditions. Who owns the new work? Who owns the improvised sections? All of the ensembles I know that have managed to create new genre-defying musics that have received both commercial success and critical acclaim are those in which all members work together to construct something new. Infusing ethno-culturally different sounds, they negotiate their terms of collaboration and of difference. Some years ago, as I attempted to start an improvisation class at the University of Toronto, I undertook some preliminary research on the role of improvisation in cross-cultural music making. All of my informants, ranging from Middle Eastern to East European to South Asian and to Latin American musicians, all said that the ability to improvise was fundamental to their creative process. One person said, "It gives me an in to begin communicating in the other person's world." Interestingly, in performance, many of these groups do not improvise. What is critical is that they rely upon improvisation in the process of creation. Another aspect of this mode of music creation that is very different to a lot of Western art music is that it is non-hierarchical. The ensembles are small enough to not require a conductor to hold things together. This is not to say that I advocate throwing out orchestra and wind band from our curricula. Not at all. Large ensemble playing teaches discipline and unified effort to a singular goal. But I also think we need to return Western art music to its improvising roots. As another of my informants declared, "The world is made of more improvised music than notated music. Period. End of story. Western music is this funny little corner of the world, the idea of the work being the notated thing. It stands to reason, even looking at it in a pragmatic and statistical way, that there are more opportunities available to you as a musician that do not require notation to play. And it is very important for collaborations with musicians of non-notated traditions. The European art music model has isolated musicians from one another." The Baroque scholar Bruce Haynes, who also advocates a return to improvisatory abilities in Western art music, describes the Western classical performer as having a cover band mentality. It's not a very flattering parallel. But in having separated theory from practice, we have become a minority musical tradition that does not know the fundamental building blocks of our own musical structure. This too needs to change if we want to engage in the active creation of Canadian music. Of course, I don't want to put our composers out of work, but I think the world of Canadian music could be that much richer if the performers also had the ability to be part of the process. So I want to give the final word to a young lady who wrote to me about 10 years ago for advice. She was the first of many. "Dear Parmela, my name is Atelka Nailasi. My main interest is Celtic music in North America, but I have also been interested in and studied Arabic folk music, violin mostly, and I bought an oud. And Hungarian folk music. My background is Hungarian. I'm currently going into third-year composition at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, where I study violin. I also play the viola, piano, bodhran, and mandolin. Could you advise me on schools that focus mostly on the performance practice of these or one of these styles, if there is such a thing? I would like to be able to play and perform in one or more of those styles in the future. I've heard of Wesleyan University in New York State, but they seem to be focused on ethnomusicology. Etelka is the perfect example of a young Canadian who wanted to explore musical styles with a shared affinity to her instrument, the violin. And she also wanted to explore her own ethnocultural identity musically. She wanted to find a way to synthesize these aspects of herself creatively. So a quick recap. She's a composition student. She's also a violinist. She wants to study a non-Western style music that is also played on the violin. And she wants to learn about the music of her ethnocultural heritage. There is nowhere that she can go in Canada to do all of those things, be a composer, performer, and an ethnomusicologist. Etelka ended up going to England, to the Birmingham Conservatoire, where she was able to combine composition with research on Hungarian music. She then went to London and took another master's degree in Arabic music at the School of Oriental and African Studies. We need to find a place for the Etelkas. We need to find a place to explore identity creatively and critically. The current climate for many Canadians is one in which we are demanding equal voices, but also individual voices. Young people are asking, who am I? Where do I belong? What do I represent? Do I need to represent? How do I do it? I was listening to James Ennis on the radio this morning. It's difficult not to be impressed by the virtuosity of his physical skill on the violin. It should be as impressive to a non-classical aficionado as the rhythmic complexity of an Ewe drum ensemble. But what we have to remember is that the Western classical music has not been a foreign entity to many non-Western cultures. It has been a symbol of Western colonialism and missionary conversion. We have to own that signification and understand why, in a country that values the symbols of ethnocultural diversity, Western art music is now just one of many. We need to find a space for musicians performing non-Western musical instruments. We need to demythologize Western art music. We need to integrate theory with practice so that we can use the incredible skills we have on our instruments and collaborate with other musicians who have their own equally impressive skills. Many years ago, Trudeau the Elder said, Canada has no singular culture. Canada has multiple cultures and microcultures and multiple nodes of possibility for creating unique and innovative new modes of expressive culture and of expressing our Canadianness. I feel like this is our time. Are we ready to rebuild? So, I'm open to questions. And I did say a few provocative things in there. Yes?
So, like, you're giving lots of points on, like, an ideal, like, music institution.
Mm-hmm.
So, would there be, like, a standard genre everyone has to learn? Or a standard, like, couple? Because I know in, like, in Grant McEwen, they have a jazz and contemporary program, so would they learn the techniques and stuff of jazz and apply it to contemporary? Would that be like the same model?
I don't know what the contemporary aspect of the Grant McEwen program is, but
That means pop learning.
oh, right. Not necessarily. It's a good question, and in a way, I think all I've really done is like offer you a bunch of questions that need a solution. I actually feel like where we need to start is being is with being open to being critical about everything, about every kind of music that we make. And the one thing I didn't talk about was technology, because we're also at a point in time where we have so many technical resources open to us that this question of, well, we can't teach every kind of music, it's almost a non-issue because you can have Skype lessons, right? So one could potentially study any kind of music. What we can do within the institutions is start to have dialogues about music and different kinds of music and different ways of approaching music. And also deconstruct some of our previously held assumptions about aesthetics and quality and excellence, and what all those mean.
Seems to me that the biggest problem we have in music schools is that we're pretty focused on skill development rather than higher level learning throughout large parts of our program, because students come with what are perceived to be not significant enough skills. So you have to get them up to a level, professional level of skills, which you can do in certain areas and not other areas without Skype lessons. So I mean, it really does mean a complete rethink of what we're doing here.
Yep.
And what is the student's responsibility and what is the program's responsibility. Because if skill development is really the student's responsibility, and higher level things, analysis, aesthetics, all of that kind of stuff then becomes more part of the program, then we load it differently. But that means that a lot of things that we do are now not done at the same level. So I guess that for many places, I think that's the problem, because you're self-replicating certain skill things that work in one kind of genre and maybe not in another.
Right. I have my own biases and my own concerns about whether learning the skills of playing the instrument actually belong in the university, whether they belong in academia or whether they belong in conservatory. Because we don't do that with other disciplines. We don't.
We have the same problem, let's say, with writing in the whole university, right? The expectations of a level of writing, which is a skill development, is not being taught early enough, so it hinges on what you can do in class, because you have to talk about grammar and structure and how to make an argument and all that kind of stuff. So I think it really is a problem, but one that I don't see as having an easy answer to, because the way the public school system and private music training is going, people aren't coming, for me it's not democratizing things, it's becoming, the Jimmy Ennises of the world are still better than they've ever been before, and there's lots of them, but that's not the average student. That's a peak in that thing, and a lot of other people are coming from high school in rural Manitoba where they don't have a music teacher.
Right.
And does that mean that they're hopelessly never going to be able to be a musician, or does it mean that we have to figure out how to open the door for them?
I think we have to figure out how to open the door to them and let them be a different kind of musician, because we know that classical music's in trouble, as a professional institution. So I don't know that the future will have nearly as many positions in orchestras, in even having solo careers or chamber music careers. There's less and less of that, and there's less of a desire to have that amongst the public. And I think that has very much to do with colonialism, and that's what I mean. I think we need to start talking about that and deconstructing why that is. So yeah, I do think we need to open the doors to other kinds of students, and teach those other kinds of students are going to come in with their own experiences that are not necessarily things that, say, the Western classical violinist knows about. Like, that other student might be able to write a song. I wouldn't know where to start. writing a song. So there's something I can learn from that. And so again, it comes to that notion of respect for differing abilities and different strengths, musical strengths. I mean, that's what I think. And it's a fundamental shift. And so that's why at the very beginning I said, I know it's a bureaucratic shift. And it's one that nobody wants to really do because it's going to be really hard. Yeah. Meg.
Thank you, first of all. It's wonderful, really thought-provoking. It's more of a question, and I'd like just to hear what your thoughts are on the reflection of this. As a Canadian, spent a large part of the training and professional life in Europe, and then coming back to Canada. And you mentioned challenges with Eurocentric training or Eurocentric sort of expectations in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, because I was born in Japan, and I see my parents a little bit, frozen with this multicultural idea in Canada. Their language is frozen, their cultural ideals and expectations are frozen because they left Japan and have been living in Canada for 40 years. And so their idea and ideals of Japan and the culture are from 40 years ago. And I'm wondering, since Europe was our template for our institutions, however many decades ago, if this is sort of similar, because I see in Europe, things have just gone forward, as you're talking about, everybody's changed their programs already. All the genres are non-defined. Students are able to define their own genres, and technology and the arts, creative arts, are all housed together to facilitate dialogue and conversation. So I'm just wondering what you think, if that could possibly be, because we've taken sort of a template, like Juilliard was crafted, their programs were crafted after the Royal College, and I'm wondering if that change, if we're sort of frozen a little bit in North America, and the rest of Europe is sort of adopted and going forward with the influx of ethnic cultures and music. I don't know, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Well, I think you make a very good point, and it's true. And the fact that this girl, Atelka, went to the Birmingham Conservatoire and was able to do what she wanted to do because they started that program about 20 years ago. 20 years ago, and we don't have anything like it here. I mean, our faculties are actually based on the American model.
All the Americans based after.
Yeah. But Europe does not have music in the university, but not performance. Performance, really?
Yeah, they do. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so not where I studied. It was very much conservatory based, and the people who did the universities like Cambridge and Oxford, my friends who were there, they had a much deeper understanding of Western music in terms of its construction and its history and all the political and social implications that went with it. But just getting the craft of learning your chops, that stayed in the conservatories. No? Okay. So maybe it's, yeah. I don't know. So maybe, I haven't been there for a long time.
But it might be a way to see, since the origins, or some origins, perhaps some influences came from, other countries, and seeing how they're approaching the challenges that we all face and the solutions. Like I look into India, and I mean, they've got so many musicians, amazing musicians, yet, and other universities like in Europe are reaching out to India because that would be a huge resource of community and bridging that gap. It Western art music institutions in India. It's mostly, their music, and I wonder if the dialogue needs to go beyond Canada to find solutions, or how we would even do that, and to be able to, that inclusivity, not just within our borders, but if we can have an international dialogue, and how we can encourage that.
And there's just, I wonder, can you clarify the Indian thing? Do you mean to have Indian musicians teach Indian music outside of India, or to learn Western?
No, to when to that inclusivity of reaching out to that population of musicians,
right,
to bring their music, to share their the music that they're creating, and I mean, there's just such a huge.
Well, the thing is that happens here. It just simply doesn't happen at the universities. It's happening outside within those ethno-cultural communities. And it's very deep, and it's happening everywhere, and it's at a very high level. But we're not engaged with that dialogue.
But that's what I'm talking about, is the European universities are reaching out to see if they can include them into this contemporary performance art sort of practice.
Yeah, well, we need to be doing it here. But we have all the resources here, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We have the resources already. We just need to acknowledge that they exist and that they are equal.
But we also have to learn their language.
Yeah, and that's where I think this ability to improvise, for us to really know, and then to sit down and negotiate and start to create, that's when you learn the language. Is when you have to actually communicate with somebody.
There's a lot more interest in improvisation now, and somebody like Stuart Goodyear, the pianist, regularly includes a section of improvisation in his various presentations. But I think you're hoping that we're all going to turn into Yehudi Menuhins and play jazz with Stefan Grappelli and Indian music with Ravi Shankar.
Right.
That's a very unique ability.
Yeah, well, maybe. But I also think that, so one of the things that I always do for example, when I sit down with a piece of Bach, a Mona Bach, I always look at it, do a chord analysis of it. And what I've never understood is why we keep theory distinct from, why we separate theory from the actual practice of our instrument. And I always wish that my violin teacher had, when she was teaching me Bach, teach me the chords. Tell me what the chords are. Instead of, I study theory with another teacher. And then I study, learning how to do this with somebody. I think those are the things we need to start integrating.
I agree with that, but I think I was lucky enough to have that kind of experience.
Yeah.
And try to pass it along.
I think often pianists do. I think for for those of us who play solo line instruments, we tend not to get it very often. But yeah, it's not impossible to do these collaborations. It is extremely difficult, and I've been doing them for years and years and years, and it involves a lot of negotiation, a lot of patience, and yeah, one ends up learning a lot, and you also end up. My own tradition, Western classical training has flourished as a result of having learned all these having collaborated with artists of different traditions. So I don't see it as a bad thing.
It just requires a willingness to learn and the time to learn.
Exactly. Yeah.
The people to train.
Yeah.
If that young woman had written you now, instead of a decade ago, and you say there's nowhere to send her, is there at least a compromise? Is there any one school in this nation that would at least be a good start for her?
Well, you know what? She actually, after that, she went to University of Alberta to try to put all those things together. She dropped out after a couple of years. because she said there was so much emphasis on critical theory and composition that she didn't have time to perform. But is there any school? Now I would say to her, maybe York University, or Simon Fraser. Maybe in Concordia. I don't know that. Actually, you know what? I would tell her Concordia, because there are some very good people there. Yeah.
So there are a couple of options at this point in time.
There are options, yeah.
I don't know the size of Simon Fraser University. York is a huge program, and a huge department of ethnomusicology and different opportunities. But how do you see our future being a smaller school?
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I brought up the indigenous population here that you have here, I mean, it's a significant size and much greater than a lot of other municipalities have, and I think that would be a good resource, you know, or you could that, or even the smaller ethnocultural populations you have here that I mentioned. Establish dialogues with them, maybe have people go out and do field work with those communities. You could start with something like that. Do small fieldwork projects, and I know rural development is something you talk about. How have these communities maintained their identity, and maybe they might be wanting to engage in some kind of creative process, creating something with students here. There are a few people from my ethno class here, and I think we've just started to tap into field work and talking to each other. And the furthest we can talk is classical jazz divide, but I think even that was really interesting that we did the other day, and the students, you know, they were learning things from each other that they didn't know. And all we have to do is go to these communities and learn something and engage in a creative process. And I think it's absolutely, I think if we don't do that kind of thing, I don't know that music institutions are going to be able to survive for much longer.
We have had a native music specialist on the education faculty here, Lynn Whitten, and I'm not sure what the situation is now. She had done field work in James Bay Cree and followed that work with in some of the native studies programs here, but I'm not sure what's happening with that. Maybe Pat or Greg, someone knows more about that.
Was that Lynn Whitten?
She's retired now.
Yeah.
That was Lynn Whitten, right?
Yes. She's now retired, but I don't know what's happening.
Well, she'll never retire.
Well, we have Naomi who's doing work as well.
So she published Essential Song, which was the sort of the catalog of work of what she recorded and interview transcriptions of the Northern James Bay Cree and Northern Manitoba Swan Cree. She is currently working on a music education text that centers on 3 types of learning. One, like the 3 places where learning exists, notation, the environment, and orally. So she's actually continued her work, and she is she's sort of moved her thinking from a definition of Indigenous being about people to be more about way of being. So a lot of the work she's doing now is about how you would use some of the music that she collected between 1970 and 1990 in a classroom, for example, because I know when I read the book and spoke with her, a lot of what's in the book isn't useful for a classroom teacher necessarily. It's a very good background, it's a good historical record, but to use it in a classroom is almost, it's not necessarily tokenism, but depending on the way in which you use it, it could be construed that way by people in your class if you happen to be teaching people from those cultures. So there are certain things you can do, like listen to a recording, but you may have no context to share with your students. So she's working on resources that would help teachers do that now, which I think is a great start. And she certainly has a really good relationship and a lot of respect from the communities she's worked with. But it takes, it's like you said, it's a lifetime. And it's about communities and partnership, and it's not an easy move or an easy shift. And there's no way to really do it without putting your own identity, maybe not necessarily at risk, but you have to consider where you come from before you can engage, especially with Aboriginal people, because of our past. Sorry, that was very long-winded. But
necessary.
yeah.
Personally, I think that we don't teach music early enough. The 4-year-old mind, you know, from daycares, there's a lot of music pollution out there. And there's a lot of Lady Gagas leading little girls to want to be some kind of Little Miss Sunshine or something. But as we look at the children, the organizing principles of music and the impact on young brains is I guess, been researched, and I don't know why people don't pick it up. But I don't think that we get enough early years training in music. And those people, I bet you a lot of your students here come from musical families where they did pick up a little Dvorak on the way to school or whatever. But the 4-year-old mind is they never learn faster than that. They are huge magnets for development. Music is math in motion to a lot of things, and we teach in daycares. We teach them how to hop and to skip and to jump and to play. But maybe some of your students should go into daycares as volunteers and bring their violins and flutes and drums, and just try and bring music at a younger age, because I worked with Jerry Hemmings on a early years psychomotor skill development with young kids, and I'm also a musician myself. I'm a fission musician, and I believe that we don't introduce in our culture the real music, the real organizing music, because it's all there. All you have to do is look at 4-year-olds. You take 24-year-olds from around the world and put them in a room. They'll start playing, and you will hear that music. But you got to be there, and you got to be. We've got to deliver music to their minds, because there's too much wrecking our minds. Rap music was created by Dr. Seuss, and anyone with a rhyming dictionary now can take over Hollywood. But that's my little bit, and I appreciate the musicians that I've met in my life. And without music, I'm a dead man. Absolutely.
I suspect music is what keeps most of us in this room going. Anyone else? I feel like I've probably raised more questions than given you answers.
This could go on, and it should be continued in coffee shops.